Paratroopers are hot in Bolt Action 3rd Edition. I mean, they've always been popular, especially because they feature prominently in many of the most widely known Hollywood productions. Band of Brothers, A Bridge Too Far, and The Eagle Has Landed are just some examples of films that bring paratroopers to the fore of a wargamer's hobby plans. But there is one paratrooper outfit that doesn't get much love from miniature manufacturers, especially in the theater for which it is most widely known. So today, let's find out if we can use existing warlord plastics to bring the Italian Folgore division to life.
Things are feeling right. You see the morning in a whole new light. There's hard work to be done, another day yet to be won. The best part of waking up is Folgers in your cup.
The Italians in Bolt Action have been receiving lots of love lately, with both Warlord Games and Wargames Atlantic releasing a total of 4 new plastic infantry kits for the faction. While these kits allow you to represent famous Italian units like the Bersaglieri, Blackshirts, and Alpini, Italian paratroopers have thus far been held back from the privilege of plastic. Warlord has produced a range in metal, though these are made in the image of the soldiers that fought on the Italian front. I'd argue that the battle they are most known for is the Second Battle of El Alamein, which places them decidedly in the Egyptian desert, and that their most famous outfit is the Folgore Division, which stood firm against overwhelming British forces and took massive casualties to allow the Germans to retreat from the battle. When I learned that the Folgore Division was severely underrepresented in 28mm, they became the easy choice for my next army. Just a heads up, so we are all on the same page, I am of course going to be pulling from historic photographs, but since Bolt Action lends itself to a stylistic approach, I am also finding inspiration from artwork, like this painting, and the Italian film Divisione Folgore. Now that the stage is set, let's dive in. If we are going to build some paratroopers, we are going to need a good foundation, and what could be a better foundation than paratroopers? The Warlord Fallschirmjäger plastics have the hallmarks of paratrooper gear: long tunics, jump smocks, and baggy pants. Baggy pants are coming back in style these days, but the Folgore were way ahead of the fashion trends. I like to use my hobby knife to score some grooves into the bottom of the miniature's pant legs, so that the green stuff we are going to apply has better traction on the plastic. Then I mix up said green stuff and apply it over the boots. For this step, I like to mix up my green stuff about 3-to-1 yellow to blue putty. The resulting mixture is softer and will blend smoother with the existing plastic. I then use my sculpting tool to add some folds to the fabric, using other miniatures and the folds in the plastic as a guide. Don't be afraid to make these pretty baggy. The next modification is fixing up the tunic. The Folgore uniform had breast pockets that are missing from the Fallschirmjäger shirt, so I roll out a thin sheet of green stuff, cut 2 small squares, and apply them to either side of the tunic. Once in place, I make a small groove for the pocket flap and a small hole to represent the button. On these tunics, I also like to get rid of this small groove that goes around the hem, either by scraping it away with a hobby knife or filling it in with green stuff. So the Fallschirmjäger bodies are certainly the most accessible bodies for converting some Folgore, but they aren't the only options. If you are building specifically for the North Africa theater, like I am, you'll notice that the Folgore also had desert uniforms, including shorts. To represent these desert uniforms, we can go to our favorite supplier of plastic shorts, the British 8th Army sprue. However, these bodies won't be ready for immediate use. We are going to have to make some modifications. Most importantly, we need to remove the British kit from the body. This includes the bayonet scabbard, the canteen, and the ammo pouches. I like to remove the bulk of these details with my clippers, and then I clean up the rest with my knife, which I also use in a scraping motion to smooth out the plastic. If these areas are a little rough, it's no problem, because we will be adding some details that can cover up messy cuts. A second, optional detail that can be removed is the socks. I've seen reference photos with Folgore wearing a similar high sock to the ones molded onto the British plastics, and some without, so I do the same. For this example, I'll remove them, first by cutting away the detail with my knife, scraping it smooth, and brushing small amounts of plastic cement over the legs to smooth out the plastic. Now, before we can add more detail to this 8th Army torso, let's look at one more body option. You can also use the Italian infantry plastics as your base. This does come with some advantages, as you'll need fewer parts from other kits, and it comes with some detail built in, like the unique Italian Canteen. However, these bodies will need the most work, but if you're up for the task, using them is a good way to get some variety in your poses. First things first, paratroopers didn't wear putties, so we will need to cover these up with green stuff, using the same technique we demonstrated earlier. Once the baggy pants have cured, we need to extend the hem of the tunic to match the length of the Folgore uniform. Using a Fallschirmjäger body as a guide, I add the green stuff in small strips, adding more where I need it, and making sure the transition between plastic and putty is smooth. Finally, I also remove the pouches in the front, which we'll replace with other details in just a minute. Now, you've probably noticed that we haven't tackled what is arguably the most defining feature of Italian paratroopers, the so-called samurai vest. These vests are instantly recognizable and can be added to any of the bodies we've worked on, but for the sake of demonstration, I'm going to add it to the Italian infantry body. For starters, I use my hobby knife to remove all the detail on both the front and the back of the torso and smooth it out with a scraping motion. For the vest detail, we can dip into any US plastics and grab a pair of these Thompson magazine pouches. They are curved to fit around a waist, so I like to first file the backside down and make it more flat, before removing a pouch or two with my knife so that it can be placed on the torso or the back. Once this is dry, I sculpt the bulk of the vest with green stuff, adding the putty bit by bit, smoothing it out, and integrating it into the pouches. Make sure you wrap it around the front and back of the torso, and add a little bit on top to the end of the pouches to create the collar of the vest. And boom, one very recognizable detail created. Not every paratrooper would be or should be wearing samurai vests, so there are some other options. Italian Airborne had their own ammunition belt, and this can be easily created using American pouches found on the US Marine sprue. Alternatively, you can use these Fallschirmjäger pouches included in their kit. Either way, I remove any unnecessary details, like this knife and this canteen. I then aim for having 4 pouches on either side of the waist, and I glue these into place. You may need to remove a little bit of the plastic around the waist of the model to get these to sit properly, depending on which body you are using. Once these are dry, I cut out space above the waist on each side so that 2 more pouches can be glued into place. And with that, it's time to move on to the arms. The best way to make Italian soldiers is to use Italian arms. Make sure to only use the carbine versions of the rifles, as the Folgore did not use the full-size versions in combat. My advice would be to source your weapons from the Bersaglieri kit, as all the rifles included are the carbine versions. You can use all the weapons included on the sprue, especially the LMGs and the Beretta SMGs. At the time of writing this, every Italian paratrooper can be equipped with an SMG, which makes them a deadly close-range unit in bolt action. So, if you're going for the 3-foot rule version of converting Folgore, just slap some of these Italian arms onto your Fallschirmjäger bodies, and you're good to go. You may need to do some trimming or gap filling, but it shouldn't be too intensive. As you've probably guessed already, we can take this a step further. One of my favorite ways to make the models look unique is to use the arms from the British 8th Army sprue, as their sleeves are rolled up, making them perfect for the desert. The 8th Army sprue includes some individual arms that are easier to use than others, like this one carrying some ammo. We can simply do a hand swap with a spare Beretta SMG to get a cool individual look. However, most of the other arms are going to need more work, as they are already attached to rifles and other weapons. This typically means we will be splicing Italian weapons onto the British arms. As an example, let's use these arms that are shouldering a Lee Enfield rifle. I cut away the trigger hand at the wrist, making sure to leave the rifle stock intact. Then I grab this Beretta SMG that can be found on all versions of the Italian sprue, and remove the trigger hand at the wrist as well, though I am more careful here as I want to preserve the wrist as much as possible. There are lots of wrist chopping with this process, as I have to also remove the hand from the British left arm. The SMG has the hand built in, so now I can attach all of these parts to the body at once. If you use plastic cement here, you will have time to position everything just right, and you can come back with more cement later to solidify the build. You may also need to use a little bit of green stuff to fill in any gaps, either in the wrists or the shoulders, but I think the final product is well worth it. Finally, if you are creating your Folgore with jump smocks, you can use arms from the British Paratrooper kit, as they have some nice loose-fitting sleeves that resemble what the Italian Paratrooper smocks were like. As before, you can use the individual arms for a simpler approach, or graft Italian weapons onto their British counterparts. I used the same technique we previously discussed, although this time I chose a carbine instead of an SMG. The face and head of our models is typically what we are drawn to first, and luckily, there are plenty of options that work representing the Folgore division. Your simplest choices are the Italian officer heads that are sporting side caps. I personally use these heads to designate my officers, mostly because you only get one or two of them, depending on which Italian sprue you have on hand. Italian paratroopers also wore berets, and there are plenty of beret iterations available in Warlord plastic. My choice would be to use the ones from the British Airborne or Commando set, and make sure to shave away the British iconography before gluing the head to the body. If you're building your paratroopers for the desert, another great source for headwear are the sun hats found on the Italian infantry sprue. There are plenty of photos of Folgore sporting these, and they look especially good on models with shorts. Make sure not to use the Bersaglieri version, however, as the feathers molded on are very specific to that unit. And of course, the odd wounded head is a great way to add further variety, and these can be found on many a bolt action sprue. But let's address the elephant head option in the room, the very distinguishable M42 helmet. These helmets do not exist in Warlord's plastic lineup, so we need to come up with a solution. For a 3-foot rule build, the best option I've found is the Folgore helmeted heads that feature the cloth helmet cover. For an easy peasy time, you could use these as is, but I think these are easily improved by shaving the cross-shaped detail on the dome of the helmet and the first padded ring. Following this, I roll up a tiny sliver of green stuff and wrap it around the helmet where the plastic was just blended. This works for tabletop standard, but for me, I wanted the distinct look of the M42 helmet. To make this wildest of dreams come true, I turned to my good buddy Ray of ZvonimirWargaming, who is a Captain Kit Bash winner by the way. Ray designed these M42 helmet STLs specifically for my project, and if you'd like to print some, I'll put the link for the free file in the description below. Thank you, Ray, I couldn't have done this without you. Anywho, we've got our paratrooper helmets, so now we need to graft them onto some heads. My favorite choice for this procedure are the helmeted heads from the British Airborne kit, as they have very similar chin straps already molded on. In a technique my longtime viewers have seen 100 times by now, I very slowly clip and shave away the original helmet, doing my very darndest to not cut into any detail on the face. After lots of small cuts and dry fitting, the helmet can be superglued into place. These make a huge difference in my opinion. If you want to reproduce the fabric cover on these helmets, 2 very thin rolls of green stuff can be applied around the helmet and pressed into shape. Reference photos show me that these rings are pretty thin in diameter, but I made mine a bit more pronounced as I think they will look better this way on the table. Once this is done, I add a tiny bit of sprue goo to the dome to create an irregular pattern simulating the fabric. Now that the bulk of our work is done, we can turn our attention to some spicy little details that will help sell these models as Folgore. Most important, at least in my mind, is that these models should all have canteens. I mean, they are in the desert, so I would think they would closely guard their sources of water. While you could probably source some 3D prints, I instead went the homegrown route and sliced a canteen away from an Italian body. With this, I created a little jig that I could use to create a mold. A blue stuff mold, to be specific. Blue stuff is a sort of thermoplastic that is very malleable when placed in hot water. Once it was pliable, I inserted my little jig into the blue stuff to create my mold. As the thermoplastic cools, it regains its rigidity, and the mold is ready to be used. I press in some green stuff and let the putty cure overnight, before removing the canteen, trimming any excess putty, and attaching it to the model. I'll also cover two other small details. First, Italian paratrooper helmets featured this rubber block at the front, and this can be added simply with a small amount of green stuff. And second, I've seen many references for Folgore using these combat knives. The Bersaglieri sprue has more than enough of these, and they can simply be added to the waist. And with that, our build is complete, and we can move on to painting. Longtime viewers of my channel will know that I don't do painting tutorials, and honestly, you wouldn't want me to. However, your choices when painting can have just as much, if not more, of an impact on your kit bashing than the actual building, because the colors are what bring the model to life and are what give us our first reading of the model. So, I want to walk you through a couple of the painting steps I use to further differentiate these Folgore paratroopers from the original models they are built from. First things first, if you are painting for the North Africa theater, get ready to use lots of variations of khakis and tans. I keep a nice little range of tones handy, because the subtle differences can help make the details of the models pop, especially when you are placing tan soldiers onto desert bases. Starting with the trousers, I use the darker toned sand brown. This contrasts well with the light earth I tend to use for the jackets. Sometimes I will even use a lighter tone, either on the jacket or the field cap, to break up different areas of the model and add variety. I also like to use deck tan for the shorts specifically, for the same reasons. Most of the details of the model are painted in traditional World War II colors. However, one standout section for me is the collar. Some reference photos show a light blue undershirt with the collar popped over the jacket, and while I'm not entirely sure if the uniform was worn like this in the field, I will jump at any chance to add color to a World War II figure, even if the historical viability of it is paper thin. This light blue helps the model stand out on the table, and the blue itself acts as a color representation of their status as paratroopers. Speaking of adding color to an almost all khaki army, I have added a few dudes wearing jump smocks. These were almost certainly ditched before arriving in the theater, but maybe a few were carried over, and I did find one painting with them being worn, so I'm going for it. Again, there are some actual painting tutorials on Italian camouflage out there, but here are the colors I use to achieve the look. Maybe the one actual good piece of advice I can give on painting camo is to make the pattern slightly larger than the real world design, as the look can easily become quite muddled at 28mm scale. The larger pattern you paint onto your mini will read much better on the table. Going back to our desert uniform paratroopers, one of the big issues I've run into is the fact that the khaki uniforms tend to blend in with the desert bases. Luckily, I have a way to combat this. I start by manually adding shadows to the folds in the uniform, the trousers, and field caps. I use a very thin paint that is a darker tone from the base color, and apply this shade wherever it makes sense. Usually I would accomplish this step with an all-over wash, but I like the control the thin paint gives me, and I can always come back in and correct any errors with the original base coat. To show how this separates the uniform from the desert sand, let's turn our attention to the desert sand. I like to start on my bases with a dark brown base coat. On top of this, I first apply a layer of Citadel Agrellan Earth all over the base. When this paint dries, it breaks apart, simulating the cracks found in dry earth. I like to apply this over the entirety of the base, because the effect is kind of random, and once it's dry, I can use Citadel Agrellan Badlands, which is a texture paint, to cover up any cracks that don't look very good. I usually end up with only 1 or 2 areas of the cracked earth showing. Once this is all dry, I hit it with an all-over wash of Citadel Agrax Earthshade, followed by a dry brushing of light earth to bring out the texture. Now, you may recall that I used light earth as a base for the uniforms. Here's my secret weapon for separating the 2 areas using the same paint. Army Painter Sepia Tone. I thin this way down to change it from a wash to more of a filter, and I apply it all over the tan areas of the uniform. Because it is a filter, it doesn't darken the recesses like a wash, but it slightly alters the tone of the base coat, creating a nice visual distinction between uniform and base. Once that is dry, we can use all our usual hobby techniques, like painting highlights and adding some foliage to the base to finish up our models. And, suddenly, these paratroopers are ready to hold back the British Commonwealth onslaught. So there you have it. These paratroopers of the Folgore division are ready for the North Africa Theater of Operations. As I've mentioned before, all these techniques we've discussed can be mixed and matched to create a wide variety of miniatures, no matter what your target is for the fidelity and historical accuracy of the final product. You can also use a lot of these techniques for Italian paratroopers in the Italian theater, or even for Desert Fallschirmjäger. There really are a ton of different possibilities. As for me, I'm slowly growing this force into my next army, and I'm using this process for weapons and vehicle crews as well, so keep an eye out for more updates on that project as a whole. If you like what you've seen in this video and want more content like this, please give this video a like and click the subscribe button on your way out. It tells both YouTube and myself that this type of content is worth it to make, and will help facilitate the creation of more. Anyways, thanks for joining me today, and we'll see you next time.